All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we have a really cool live stream to show you. So the reason I think today's live stream is so cool is because we actually had this one recommended to us by a user. So we actually had a user come in and say, hey, I would love to see this task, and that's exactly what we're doing. So if you guys have any ideas for tasks that you guys would like to see, by all means, send us an email. Let me know. Go to support.pstnet.com. Say, hey, I'm working on this task. I'd love to see Devon do it. I think other people would benefit too. Definitely shoot me a line. So today's task is the Sustained Attention to Response task, or the SART. Now, the version of the task that we're going to be making today is probably the most basic version of it that was created in 1997. So we're not really going to add too many bells and whistles onto it. We're just going to kind of do the standard, sustained attention to response task just to give you a really good basis to start from for your experiment if you decide to do this at home. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be presenting participants with numbers from 1 to 9. And we're going to say, hey, for every number that you see, press a button on the mouse. The only time you're not supposed to press a button is if you see a 3 come up. So every time a 3 appears, that's when you have to not press a button on the mouse. So it's a little bit like a go, no-go task, but it's going to last way longer, and there's going to be way more distractor variables than there are going to be in a standard go, no-go task, which is why, the sustained attention response task. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So if you guys are following along at home, I'm using ePrime 3. However, we're not really going to be using a lot of ePrime 3 specific features. So if you have ePrime 2, by all means, follow along. It's going to work exactly the same way. So in our template selection here, we're going to go ahead and just select a blank template and click OK. Now it's going to take a second to load the template because it's technically opening up an entirely new eStudio file in the background. That's something that not a lot of people understand about those templates, is it's actually just a whole other eStudio file. And if you want to make your own, you absolutely can, and that's really easy to do. So now that we have our blank eStudio open, the first thing that we're going to do is make a welcome screen for participants. Just a very simple screen saying welcome to the task, something that you can maybe leave open in a lab and just have sitting while the participant comes in so they don't have to see this, something your research assistant could set up beforehand. So what we're going to do is we're going to double click on the session proc here, and I'm going to add a text display object as the first object on my procedural timeline. Now for those of you who are new to ePrime, this little green button on the left, a little green circle, represents the very start of the experiment, and on the right side this represents the very end of the experiment. So everything in between here is going to be presented in the order that it appears on this procedural timeline. So let's go ahead and take a text display object, because all I'm going to do is just write a very simple message. No pictures, no movies, nothing fancy. Just some text on the screen for participants, and I'm just going to take it and drag it and drop it onto the screen right here. Now I want to rename this one from text display 1, and you can rename it by right-clicking and clicking on rename here, or I'm a huge fan of keyboard shortcuts, so you might see me use a couple of them today. I like just clicking F2. I think it's much faster. But either right-click and click rename, or click F2, and then we'll just call this one welcome. And now let's double-click on it to open its properties. Now, one of the cooler features of ePrime that not a lot of people know too much about is if you hover your mouse over an object, it actually gives you a lot of the properties without having to open the object itself. So I can see immediately how long it's on the screen. I can see what sort of data logging is set for it without having to jump in and kind of, look at all of the properties. And that's really, really cool, especially that task events one. That's pretty neat, especially if, you want a quick overview of what someone's experiment's doing. I know I personally do it all the time when I'm a technical consultant. When I'm looking over people's experiments, I can see at a glance all of the properties that they've said about this object. So let's hop back into welcome, and let's make a very simple screen that can just be up while our participants walking in. Say, welcome to the experiment. Press any button on the mouse to begin, or to continue. There we go. So the purpose of this task, or at least the original 1997 version of the task, is that it was all mouse-based. There wasn't really any keyboard responses, and I don't want to necessarily add in a chronos to this, even though, if you do want no debounce time on your response, then we do recommend a chronos. The one thing about mice that's important to keep in mind too is that they're notorious for variable debounce time, which just means a differential between when the participant clicks the button and when the computer registers that that button's been clicked. That's called debounce. In the most very basic sense, it's called debounce in computers, and it's definitely something that that you need to keep in mind whenever you're doing response on a mouse or anything like that. Keep in mind what that debounce time is, but I'm just going to be copying or emulating that 1997 version of the task. So all of our responses here will just be mouse based. All right, so now that we have our very simple text here, let's go ahead and click on the properties page in the upper left hand corner. And there's our properties page. And I'm going to go over to the duration input tab. Now I like the font. I'm not really going to change anything with the font or the frame with how it sits on the screen. But I am going to go to this duration input tab here, and I'm going to set the duration to infinite. Because like I said, the point of this screen is that really it just kind of sits there in the lab and just hangs on this screen until we're ready to move on. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to change my data logging here to standard. I know that this necessarily isn't the most important thing that you could be logging data on, but the rule that I always like to follow is that I like to log more data than less data. So even if I do end up with how long this welcome screen was on, or this welcome text display object was on the screen, or what they clicked to get out of it, I think it's completely fine. Like I said, rather more than less. I'm going to go ahead and click Add here under Input Masks, and what that's going to let me do is it's going to let me pick a device through which participants are responding. Now, in this case, like I said, it's all going to be a mouse task, so I'm going to just click on Mouse and click OK. Now, I can define a key if I really want, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to have my allowable set to any. I'll keep my time limit the same as duration, my end action to terminate. Click Apply and OK, and I'm good. So that's all I need for that welcome screen. Now the next thing I need is some instructions. I need participants to actually know what they're going to be doing in this task before I actually have them do it, otherwise they're not going to understand. So I'll take another text display object and put it just after my welcome screen. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one. I just use that keyboard shortcut. I'll rename this one to instructions. There we go. I'll double click on it to open it in my workspace here. And then now I'll just write some very simple task instructions. Now this task is pretty simple, so I'm just going to write something pretty simple. So, will be shown a number followed by a mask. You will see numbers 1 through 9. If the number, I'll put when you see almost any number, left click on the mouse. When you see the number 3, do not click anything at all. Left click on the mouse to practice this. There we go. So, very simple task instructions. Just in this task, you will be shown a number followed by a mask, and I realize my head's in the way there. Give me 1 sec. And I can... There we go. So, in this task, you will see a number followed by a mask. You will see the numbers 1 through 9. When you see almost any number, left click on the mouse. When you see the number 3, do not click anything at all. And then left click on the mouse to practice this. So then we just have to add a left click on the mouse. So to do that, go ahead and click on the properties page. My properties page keeps showing up on my other secondary monitor, which is why I keep looking over and grabbing that. Duration input will change to infinite as well. Data logging will set to standard. And I will add another mouse input device. Now my allowable at this point, instead of being set to any, is actually just going to be set to 1. Now that's how ePrime logs a left click on the mouse. It actually logs it as a 1. So if you want only the left click to be available, you just specify 1 right there. If you want a right click to be available, you specify a 2. 3 is for clicking on the scroll bar, those types of things. And every kind of mouse is set up differently. I actually saw a mouse once that has a full number pad on the side as well. I think it was a gaming mouse. But each mouse is kind of mapped differently. But in general, 1 is left click, 2 is right click. We don't need to set it correct if our allowable is only going to be 1. I'll go ahead and click Apply and OK to save those changes. There we go. Close out of these. Now I'm going to open up my session proc again because I want to make a practice proc and I want to make a critical proc. So at this point, my experiment is basically going to break into 2 tracks. The first track is for practice and the next track is for critical tasks. To make my experiment do that, I need to add a list object. So I'll take a list from my toolbox and drag it and drop it just after my instructions. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one to block list. For those of you who are wondering, why block list? Why are you making a list? Like, what is the purpose of a list object here? I definitely recommend checking out some of my other live streams. I go over this in a lot of detail in a lot of my other live streams about, why it's called block list, why I put it here, what its purpose is, those types of things. And as always, if you're curious and you're watching, leave me a message. I'm always happy to help. So I'm going to double click on block list here, and I'm going to make my first procedure, which is going to be my practice set of procedures. So I'm going to call this one prac block proc, and I'm going to hit enter. Prac for practice, and then block proc it's going to be the block procedure for all of my practices. And it says that it does not exist. Would I like to create it? And of course I would, so I'm going to click yes. Would I like to make it the default value for newly created levels? Generally, I find that if you're doing a block list type of thing, you want to hit no to this dialog here. So basically what that means is if I ever add another level here by clicking on this add level button, which, spoiler, I'm totally going to later, then it's not going to automatically fill in this procedure column here, which is exactly what I want because the next procedure is actually going to be another procedure. Let's go ahead and double click on prac block proc to open it. So now that I have my experiment splitting where I need it to split, I'm now down the practice track, if you will. So in order to do that, in order to actually set this up, what I need to do is start making my independent variables for the practice portion of this task. So to make independent variables and to manipulate variables really at all in ePrime, what you'll need to do is make a list object. And you can take a list object by taking it from the toolbox and putting it as the first object in the prac block proc. I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to prac trial list. Again, if you're wondering where I'm getting that name or why I have that name, feel free to watch some of the other live streams. Like I said, I really go into depth about a lot of the naming stuff that we do here. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on prac trial list here quick. And my procedure is going to be prac trial proc. So go ahead and type that into procedure and hit enter. It doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Yes. Now, would I like to make it the default value for newly created levels? In this case, I'm going to hit yes. And I want to hit yes mostly because this is going to be a trial level list object. And for trial level list objects, especially when you're manipulating independent variables, you want all of those independent variables to be presented to the user at the same time. You want all of them to be continuously presented on the same procedure. So in this case, I'm going to click yes. But this needs a little bit more information on it. So I'm going to go ahead and add another attribute here, and I'm going to call this one stim number. I'm calling it stim number because I like to name my attributes the same way I like to name my e-objects. An e-object, by the way, is a text display object or a slide object. Anything in here under the e-objects heading is an e-object in ePrime. But I like to name my attributes the same way. I like to make the name reflect the function of the attribute. So the purpose of my stim number attribute is that I'm going to be presenting my stimuli, and that stimuli is going to come in the form of a number. Now, like I said, it is between the numbers 1 through 9, and as you can see here, I only have one row, so I can only fill in one number at a time. So I need to add more rows. So what I can do is I can click this add number or add level button, so I can add more numbers here. There we go. Or I can click on this add multiple levels and then add however many I want. And in that case, I clicked 5 very quickly. I did 5 and then enter. So I can then follow along here. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. There we go. So now that we have all of our stim numbers down, you'll notice that 3 is the one that requires kind of not the most work, but is the odd one out here, because that's one participants aren't supposed to respond to. So what I need to do is I need to click on this add attribute button one more time, and I need to make a correct response attribute. There we go. So now that I have my correct response attribute, I'm going to have participants left click on the mouse in order to create a correct response. and that applies to 1 and 2, but not 3. So I'm actually going to click delete now, because I want this one to be blank. And the reason I want it to be blank and not to be a question mark is because it's actually going to end up interacting with my allowable column if I keep it as a question mark. The question mark is always a good default because it's kind of like a little sign in E' for, hey, fill something in here. But for now, we just need to fill these in with 1s. So I'm just going to keep doing that. There we go. And then 3, if you notice, is the only one that's blank. So these are all the ones participants are supposed to respond to. These are the ones that they're not. All right, so then the only thing I want to do is I want to make a couple of changes to how this is presented and how often this is presented. I want participants to get the feel of whether or not they're supposed to be responding to 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this list object set to sequential so they can anticipate when 3 is coming. That way they know, oh, hey, now, I did 1 and 2. Guess what's coming up next? I probably shouldn't respond to it. That way they get the feel for the timing of everything, because that's really one of the most important parts of this task, is that each and every one of the blocks is a consistent amount of time, so participants can anticipate click now, click now, click now, click now. And it's that pattern that they're supposed to get into that makes not responding when 3 comes up so difficult. So I'm going to keep this at sequential selection here, and I'm going to click on the Properties page icon at the top of the screen. And I'm going to click on the Reset Exit tab. Now, I want participants to run through the practice trials 2 times. And I want them to run through it 2 times because let's say they don't quite catch on that it's going to be presented in random or in sequential order. And let's say they accidentally push a button during 3, they get that incorrect feedback, and then they go, oh, I should have known for next time. Well, no, they have a next time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this one to 2. And you see here it changes. 1 cycle is 9 samples, and I'm running this for 2 cycles of 9 samples, which means 18 samples total. Go ahead and click Apply and OK, and that's all I need to do to this list object. Now I need to actually start using these things. Let's go ahead and close out of all of these windows. You can do that just by clicking Window and then Close All. I know I did that really fast earlier, but it's probably one of my favorite things. If you've ever beaten Solitaire, another one of my favorite things is doing this cascade mode by clicking Cascade and then clicking Close All, and they all close in a very satisfying way. So what I'm going to do now is go into my trial proc here. Now, what I need is a fixation and a mask. A fixation. I need my number, or my stim number, and a mask. Now, the trick here is that the mask is going to be presented, or the number itself is going to be presented very quickly. In fact, it's only going to be presented for about 250 milliseconds. That's how long it was defined in the 1997 article that I read. So it's going to be responding lightning quick. But I also want participants to be able to respond or make a response during the mask. So we'll have to set this up a little differently. So what we'll do is we'll first take a slide object. You don't necessarily need a slide object. This could technically just be really any text display object if you want, since it's just displaying text in the center of the screen, but I like working with slide objects. I'm going to take a slide object and I'm going to put it as the first object in my procedural timeline here. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this slide1 object just to stim display. That way that I know that this is the object that's displaying my stimuli. Go ahead and double click on it to open it in the workspace here. And as you can see, it's pretty blank, so I'll need to add a slide text sub-object to the middle of it in order to start displaying text. So I'll click on it. And as you can see, all you have to do is click on it. It's not a drag and drop motion. When you click on it once, you'll see that there's a little, we'll call it a little slide text sub-object icon right next to my cursor, which means that one's kind of, I like to think of it as being loaded and ready to go. And all you do is just click where you want it on the screen, and it goes there. So I'm going to double click on the word text here, and I'm going to delete it because I don't want text to show up. I want my number to show up. And I'm going to click on the left square bracket on my keyboard. And as you can see, one of my favorite features pops up, a trip sense. So now I just get to pick this stim number attribute, click on it, and it is a perfectly formatted attribute reference. For those of you who are new to E', this means that E' isn't going to display the word stim number, or the word stim number in those square brackets. It's actually going to hop into my practice trial list, and it's going to look for everything under that stim number column there and display what's in that column instead of the word stim number. Think of it as like a placeholder. That's probably the best way to think about that. So now I want this to be displayed in the exact center of the screen because I also need my mask to be there as well. And that's one of the important things. That mask needs to go right over top of where that number is going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and click once on my text1 slide text sub object is what we call it. And you can see that it shows up in this little pane up here. That's how you know what properties you're going to access when you click on this button. So for example, if I have my state 1 selected and I click on this properties button, it'll say, whoops, it'll say that there is, or that I'm showing my properties specifically for the slide state of that one, or that slide state. However, if I click on the stim number, it's going to show me the properties for that stim number, and they're over here. So this is the state 1 properties here. That's the properties for the slide state, and it's not going to show me anything about stim number or that slide text sub object. But if I drop down to text 1 and click on properties, you can see that now I have properties for my text 1 object, which is exactly what I want. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to frame because I need it to be in the dead center. And I like to kind of play a guessing game whenever I drop these things, and I like to try to guess, like, is this the center? And as you can see, I'm about 4 to 5% off, which honestly isn't too bad. But to make sure it's in the dead center, I'll go ahead and click on center for the X value and center for the Y value there. Click apply and OK, and I'm good. So now I have my stim number already set. It's in the middle, and it's going to change on a per trial basis based on what is in my prac trial list. So what I need to do is then go to the other properties page icon just on the left-hand side of the screen here. And this, unlike the other properties page, this is going to give me the properties for the entirety of the slide object itself. So this is where I can go to duration input tab and set that duration. Now keep in mind that this is going to be the very, very fast one that appears. So this is only going to be on for 250 milliseconds. But I'm going to keep my data logging set to standard because this is really the important thing that we need to keep track of for data. I want to know, how long this was on the screen. I want to know how accurately they responded to it. I want to know, how, if they responded or not and what the correct response was and those types of things. So I'll keep my data logging set to standard there, and I'm going to go ahead and add a mouse input mask. Now, keep in mind, there are a couple of ways that you can do this as far as setting up the properties. Oops. As far as setting up the response options for the mouse object, one way that you can do this is keep your allowable to any. And this really all depends on how much control you want over what participants press. If you want, you can keep the allowable set to any. And participants can click on the right-click button. They can click on the scroll bar. They can click on any other mouse buttons that they might have access to. And that'll be completely fine, and it'll also register. However, if you want to restrict the mouse to only being able to press 1 on the mouse, you can also do that too. I'm going to set that up that way, but that might differ per lab or what your professor wants you to do or anything like that. So I'm going to keep that set to allowable of 1 and correct. I'm going to make an attribute reference for that correct response attribute I made. Now keep in mind, if you're like me and name attributes and go, what did I call that? We have a very easy solution for you. I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK, but if you're following along at home, please feel free to keep this up. I'm just going to show you something quick. You can go over here to this browser button and click on attributes in this Experiment Explorer, and you can see all of the attributes that you made and what you called them. So here is my correct response attribute. So I go, oh yeah, that's what it was called. And then I can reference that in my duration input tab right there. All right, so keep in mind that this task itself is going to be, or the response window for participants is going to last much longer than the 250 milliseconds that this object is going to be on the screen. That's one of the most important parts of this task, is they can also respond during that mask whenever it appears for 900 milliseconds. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change my time limit here from same as duration just until feedback. Now I'm going to do until feedback right now because I'm going to have a feedback display object on the screen later. However, what I can also do if I really wanted to is I know how long my other object is going to be. My other object is going to be 900 milliseconds. That's just defined by the 1997 article that I read. So all I need to do then is I need to add the 900 milliseconds to the 250 milliseconds that I have now, and that's going to get me 1500 milliseconds. So I know that the time limit for the entire response window is going to be that long. So what I do is set my time limit here to that property, And then I have my duration of this object set to 250 milliseconds, and I have the duration of my next object set to 900 milliseconds, and then that's going to get me that total of that time limit there. So one option, like I said, is to just click until feedback, especially if it's going to be a variable duration, or if you just don't want to do math, you can definitely set until feedback, or if you know how long that's going to be, you can set it, you can hard code it to a definite amount of milliseconds right here. And that's how I'm going to keep it for now. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK, because that's all I need there. And let's go ahead and make that mask object. So the mask doesn't necessarily need to be a slide object like this does. The mask can be a text display object as well, because all it's going to be is just a number sign on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my prac trial proc, and I'm going to drag and drop a text display. Now the reason I'm doing a text display and not another slide object like my stim display will become pretty apparent in a second. I want to show off one of the little features of the text display object. So go ahead and rename this one just to mask, like that, and I'm going to click OK. Go ahead and double click on it to see its properties here, and I'm just going to type the number sign. Now this was the reason that I wanted to use the text display over another slide object, is because now my text display is set up perfectly to overlap with what's currently on the stim display, and I know it totally doesn't look like that. Right now it looks like that number sign that I have is going to show up at the very center, at the very top of the screen whenever you run. However, since these properties here, if I go into the properties page, drag them from my other screen, if I go into my properties page here, the align horizontal and align vertical properties are set to center. So that means that regardless of what this looks like during design time, it's actually going to reorient itself to the middle of the screen whenever this task runs. So that's really all I need to do for this. Now I'm going to go over to my duration input tab, because this is the other important part. I had mentioned that this task needs to be 900 milliseconds. So what I'm going to do is change my duration here to 900. I'm going to change my data logging here to standard, and I don't want participants to respond during this, or I don't want another input mask during this, because participants are going to be responding using the stim display input mask. So for newer ePrime users, this part gets a little confusing, and I can totally understand why. Because I have an input mask set on stim display, but they can respond to that input mask while mask is on the screen. Now the effect of this is that when you open up your data file, you're going to see responses to stim display even though they responded while it looked like the mask was on the screen. That's because we took that input mask for stim display and extended it for the entire duration of my mask object. So you're going to end up seeing some RT values for stim display at 700 milliseconds, 800 milliseconds. And that's completely fine, because even though the stim display object only lasted for about 250 on the screen, participants still were able to respond while the mask was up. So that's one thing that, kind of newer ePrime users think they have to take into account. They think they have to add all of these other input masks, but they really don't, or you really don't. All you really need to do if you want participants to extend a response time past when an object is on the screen is just set the time limit for longer than the duration, and that's all you really have to do. Alright, so I'm going to click apply and OK to save these. And now I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate some inline script. And this is just some very basic inline script. I know this script isn't strictly necessary given our task, but I always like to practice it, especially for users who are pretty new. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be making something called an if-then statement. And that if-then statement is going to handle the accuracy explicitly whenever the participant doesn't click on 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my trial proc here, and I'm going to go ahead and add an inline object. Now the inline I'm going to go ahead and rename just to process response. Well, I'll just say process non-response. There we go. And I'll go ahead and double click on it to open it. Now this is one of the reasons why, honestly I think that inline script is a little intimidating for first time ePrime users. The inline object, when you open it, is just completely blank, and you can do whatever you want on it. And it kind of seems almost like decision paralysis. There's just so much you can do here, and newer people who are newer to script just go, oh, what do I write? But all you have to do, and the easiest way to do this, at least the way that I started, was to start with what we call pseudocode. Now, this either works for you or it doesn't, and I'm just going to demonstrate it real quick. But what I like to do is what I liked to do before I knew all of the syntax for everything, is just say if no response to stim display when correct response is nothing, then, I mean, and I'm obviously formatting this kind of like an if-then statement because I know what I'm doing, but I know where I'm going with this, and I'll put then stim displays accuracy is correct, and then I'll need an end if statement. So even if you have the very most basic understanding of scripting, you know how an if-then statement is structured, write something like this. Say, if no response to stim display when correct response is nothing. So all you have to do now that you've written the structure of the code or the script is just go back and break it into chunks and say, okay, well, what do I know the syntax for? And if not, where can I look it up? And you can definitely look it up if you want to by going to help and clicking on the E' command reference. It is an awesome place if you want to look up any sort of specific syntax when scripting. Because right now my structure of this script is spot on. The syntax is just wrong. So let's go ahead and start changing some of the syntax. So I have if no response to stim display. So that means if stim display dot resp equals blank. When correct response is nothing. So when really isn't what we're looking for there, we'll just say and then correct response. Correct response is an attribute that I made in my prac trial list. So what I need to do is get the value of it. So I'll do c.getAttrib, and as you see when I was typing, that was what's called script sense. If you start typing, it starts trying to guess what you're typing. And I did c dot, and these are all the things that could follow c dot. So in this case, I do want c.getAttrib. And then if you look, attrib sense appears here too. So not only does it appear on slide objects and on text display objects, it also appears in script. And I'm looking specifically for correct response, and what it does is it actually formats that part of the script for you. All right, so I have this part. So now I need is nothing. So I do if correct response equals blank, then, because that's how my if-then statements need to end their first line. So now I have a properly formatted first line, and all I needed to do was just write that pseudocode and just start building from there. And now I have stim display accuracy is correct. So stim display accuracy, I can delete that and type in stim display.acc, and then is correct in E' correct is 1, so I'll just do equals 1. And there I have it. So that is now a properly formatted bit of script using pseudocode, or starting from pseudocode if you want to do that. And if you want to check to see your syntax is correct, I'll have to save it first. So I'll go ahead and save it, and I'll just save it here, just in samples and tutorials. I'll make a just a little part here, just called SART. And then if you want to check to see if your syntax is correct, go ahead and click on this generate button. And what it's going to do is it's going to generate all the script, and if it's incorrect, so let's say I say, instead of stim display, I'll say sim display. I made a typo there. If I click on generate, E' is going to point that out to me. So it's going to say left of period must be an object, structure, or dialogue, and it's flashing this line at me. Well, there's only one period here, and left of it is this part, so that means this is the part of my script that's wrong. And right now it's sim display. Now I don't have an object called that, it's stim display. And that's all you need to do really to start troubleshooting script. If you ever wonder what E' tech support does behind the scenes, if you ever submit a ticket and try to get help from them, this is what they do. They generate your experiment and try to see what's wrong in this way. Alright, so the last thing we want to add after we have our inline script is we're going to have a feedback display. So we'll just take a feedback display from our toolbox, drag it just after the inline script, and you don't necessarily need to rename feedback display objects. They're pretty self-explanatory, but if you really need to, you absolutely can. I'm just going to go ahead and rename this one to feedback. Now, there's really only one property you need to be changing about a feedback display object. If you already like the way it looks and you like the statistics that you're getting, right now correct is going to be at RT seconds response time. So it'll show you what the reaction time was for your response and then your overall mean correct. This is what incorrect is going to look like. I like the red and blue font. If they don't make a response, which is actually good, then no response is going to show up, and then pending is something we're not going to have to worry about. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page and just go to this input object name, and I want to make my input object name stim display. Now the input object name property for the feedback object is just like saying, hey, for what object am I showing feedback? And in this case, it's going to be that stim display object. Now keep in mind that this feedback isn't going to be on every single trial. I know that that's really not something that, or it's not going to be on every single part of the task. It's only going to be in the practice part of it. Because it's not necessarily something you want to show participants while the task is actively going on, because that timing, like I said, is what's so important. It's going to be that like second, that like just over a second timing that we want, that 1,150 milliseconds. That's going to be what we really want, and we need participants to start getting into that rhythm, and that feedback display is just going to break that up. So the feedback right now is just to let participants know, hey, you're doing it right because this is the practice. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close all of these because just click on Windows and click on Close All, because I'm now done. Like, I don't need to edit anything else about this object or about the practice procedure. All I need to do now is make my critical trials. And now that I already made most of this stuff for the practice trial, creating critical trials is going to be a breeze. So I'm going to go back into my block list, because when I made the block list, I kept doing this with my hands and saying I'm splitting the experiment. This is where I'm actually doing that. So I'm going to click on Add Level here. And instead of prac block proc, I'm going to type just block proc and hit enter. Now it says it doesn't exist, but I like to create it. I'm going to hit yes, and look where it shows up. It actually shows up underneath all of my practice trials, which in E' is shorthand for saying this is what's going to happen afterwards. So E' is going to run into my block list. It's going to go through all of my prac block proc first, including all 18 trials, and then it's going to go to block proc. So what I want at the beginning of my block proc is I want a very simple text display for participants that just says, hey, thanks for practicing. Here's some critical trials now. So to do that, I'm going to click on text display, and I'm going to add it as the first object in my block proc. And I'm just going to call this one end practice. And hit enter there. I'm going to double click on it to open it in the window, and I'm just going to write that message I talked about. I'll say this ends practice portion of the trial, of the task. You will now move on to the critical trials and will not receive feedback. Press, well, let's say left click. Click on the mouse to begin critical trial. Critical. There we go, trials. All right, and we're going to click on the properties page button in the upper left-hand corner. Click on the duration input tab, and again, I just want this to be on the screen for as long as participants need it. And I'm going to add a mouse there, and then I'm going to keep my allowable, or change that from any to 1. And just click apply and OK. And that's all I need. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the block proc now. Now, editing this is going to be a little different than how we edited our prac trial list. I know nobody really wants to watch me go ahead and type all 1 through 9 again and redo the exact same thing, so I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on prac trial list and hit Control-C on my keyboard. Visually, it doesn't look like anything happens, but trust me, something does. So after my end practice here, I'm going to hit Control-V on the keyboard, and it's going to say the object you're pasting contains child objects, because I'm now pasting that list object. So as it contains child objects, would I like to paste all of the child objects? I'm going to hit no. Now, quirk of E', if you hit Control-V on a procedure like this, it shows up as the first object. All I need to do is just take my end practice and throw it just before my prac trial list 1. So what it does is, since I was only pasting the list object, it made a copy of it called prac trial list 1, which isn't really descriptive, so I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to trial list, because it's no longer our practice. But if you look in our procedural timeline here, you can see that it's referencing prac trial proc, and you can see that it's referencing every single object that I already have in here. Now, this is both good and bad. It's good if you want these two procedures to be identical, then this is actually how we recommend setting up your experiment. If the two procedures are going to be identical, then there's no sense in making two identical procedures, just reference the same one twice. However, if they're going to be different in any way, this is where we run into problems. So if you remember in my NPRAC, I said you will now on the critical trials and will not receive feedback. So my critical trials here don't need feedback. So if I go to delete feedback, it actually deletes it in both places. And that's where we start running into problems with this. So the whole reason why I copied and pasted in the first place is so I can go into my trial list and it's all set up for me. My stim number is already there, my correct response is there. The only thing I need to do is just change this so there are 225 trials. So I can go into my properties page here, go to reset exit, and then I can either type in 25 cycles, or if I have a very specific trial number, which I did, but if it's not divisible by the number of trials, or the number of cycles, I can actually just type after 220 samples in and of itself. So that's entirely up to you how you do it. Either way, it's going to get you 225 samples of this list object. And I'm also going to change the selection here from sequential to random. Now, notice that unlike that feedback object that I deleted, this trial list is its own thing. And that's why I copied and pasted it, because it's now set up exactly how I need. I just needed to tweak two properties, but I didn't have to, it wasn't the same object being referenced twice. It was its whole new object, which is why it had that 1 at the end. The only other thing we need to do is we need to change this procedure, because having prac trial proc in here is problematic for obvious reasons. You just saw why. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete the word prac from that procedure and hit enter. It says the procedure trial proc doesn't exist, but I like to create it. I'm going to click yes. And now what I do is, you can look here under my trial list. You see I have two procedures, one called trial proc and one called prac trial proc. And trial proc is empty, but it's the one that I'm going to want. So I'll go to my procedure here, and I'll just use my little fill handle. And you can take that, or get that by taking the mouse into the bottom right hand corner and just dragging and dropping all the way down. And you can see that it fills it all in with trial proc. And if you're paying attention to this little experiment explorer on the left, whenever I did that, you'll notice that prac trial proc completely deleted itself from here. So now the only thing I have is this trial proc that's completely blank. Now, instead of having to sit there and, add each object and make each object again, what I can do is just drag and drop from my prac trial proc only the objects that I want. So I want my stim display object, I want my mask, and I want my process non-response inline, but I don't want feedback. So now I have all of these objects. They're all pre-formatted, and keep in mind, since they are being referenced in two places, any changes I make here will also impact my practice. But I want the practice to be as close to possible to my critical trials anyway, so that's actually ideal. So I do all of that, and that's all I need for my critical trials there. So now I have practice and I have critical trials. So we're going to go ahead and end this experiment like I end all of my experiments. Go ahead and open up the session proc. Take a text display object and put it just after block list. If you'll see, it added as the very last object in our procedural timeline there. And I'm going to rename this one just to goodbye. We'll make a pretty nice goodbye message. So just thank you very much for your participation. Please let the researcher know you are done. We don't want too many exclamation points. I will click on the properties page here, and in the properties page I'm going to go ahead and set my duration to infinite, my data logging to standard, and I'm actually going to make this one a keyboard response of space. Now this is something that if you format it this way, some of the participants may not guess once they see this. They might not accidentally hit the space key, but it's something that your research assistant could know. That way the participant doesn't really even need to see anything other than the E' task up on the screen. Then when the participant leaves and is debriefed, the research assistant can come back, click space on the space bar, and you're good. So go ahead and click apply and OK to save these changes. And that's all we need to do. That is the SART. Alright, so if you guys want to run it and test it out, you can either run by clicking on this run button, or I recommend, if you're running on live stream like I am, clicking on windowed mode. Windowed mode is actually going to open it up in its own window here. I can have ePrime enable auto response using the keyboard, and ePrime will just start clicking through for me, and I'm just going to do that. I can have it run up to 4 times its normal speed, which would be a little insane, and I probably don't want. And then I'm going to go ahead and click test just to show you what this guy looks like. Actually shows up over here. There we go. Any button on the mouse, left click. So if you notice, I clicked during the, if you can hear my mouse click, I ended up clicking during, so that was correct. I ended up clicking during that mask. That's still okay because of how we set up that inline object. And that's what happens when I don't respond. 7 came up. 8. And then let's see what happens when we respond during 3. Because these show up in sequential order, so know when 3 is going to happen. So there's 1. I won't respond to 2. No response detected. That's good. I responded during 3. I got it incorrect. So that's perfect. And then I'll just let this go into critical trials then and end it quick. But if you want, if you look behind here, you can see all of the data as it's actively being collected in this little window here. You notice I keep running over. So this is my NPRAC, and I accidentally clicked out of it. So now this is just showing up. This is when participants kind of get into that rhythm, and I'm not getting any feedback on any of this. So whether or not I'm clicking anything, the task just kind of goes. All right, and then if I want to end this early, which I do, I'm going to go ahead and click on exit here. It's going to go ahead and exit out of the task, and if you saw there, I actually made data files. So that's one of the benefits of running it in windowed mode there, is if you click exit at the very top, you still end up getting a data file to look at, and this will be pretty good pilot data. So if I want to look at the exact data that I'm interested in, I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these, because if you notice there's a lot of stuff here I don't really need. And I really only want to look at a couple of variables. So first off, I want to look at my stim number. So stim number is there. I'm going to go ahead and add that so I can see whenever 3 shows up. And then I want to look at my stim display. I'll look at RT and response. And I'll look at accuracy. Go ahead and add all of those and click OK. So my response is 1 whenever I responded 1, and it is blank whenever I didn't respond to anything. So this looks like it is set up exactly the way I want here. Accuracy is 0 because a 5 and a 6 showed up, and I didn't respond to them at all, so that was not great. For 3 here, my accuracy was 1, my response was nothing, and my RT was nothing, which is exactly what I want. And then here's how I showed you, oh hey, sometimes you might get some larger RT values even though it's on the screen for 250 milliseconds. This one actually took me a little over 1 second to respond to, and I still got that right, even though, clearly the stim number was off the screen at that point. All right, so that is all the content I have for today's webinar. If you guys have absolutely any questions at all, please feel free to go to our support site, just support.pstnet.com. Always feel free to leave a comment here as well. We're always happy to help. We have a lot of different resources for experiment help as well. So, definitely, feel free to ask about those different resources too, either in the comment for this video or anything like that. So, thank you guys very much for attending today's live stream, and have a great day.